Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome back again to this is our final session for the first day of PASC21. I hope that you've had a great time and enjoyed the mini symposia and the paper presentations that happened earlier this afternoon, and maybe even had a chance to catch up with friends and colleagues in the social space. So this session, we will have an interdisciplinary dialogue followed immediately by the flash poster session. So I do hope that you can stay throughout the session with us. The interdisciplinary dialogue is really a conversation between two eminent scientists, and we're very pleased this year to welcome Eric Lindell as the interviewer and Peter Coveney as the interviewee, and together they will discuss the topic, I love biology, why don't biologists love theory? Of course, Eric and Peter really need very little introduction by me, so I won't take time to do that. But let me just say that they are, of course, both world-leading scientists in their own disciplines, and they are strong advocates for scientific computing and for interdisciplinary research. Eric, who I will hand over to in a moment, is Professor of Biophysics at Stockholm University and KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. And he is a firm believer in the PASC conference series as a venue that bridges computer science and scientific disciplines. He's former chair of the PRACE Scientific Steering Committee and currently sits on EuroHPC's Research and Innovation Advisory Group. Eric is also a member of the CSCS Scientific Advisory Board and the Swedish Royal Academy of Engineering Scientists. So without further ado, Eric, I will hand over to you and invite the audience to sit back and enjoy 40 minutes of very stimulating conversation, I'm sure. Eric.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. It's great to be here, even in the virtual version of Geneva, or in my case, the northeastern suburbs of Geneva. One of the things that I do love about PASC is that it's not just about great research, but it's also an opportunity for reflection, both inside our community and between different disciplines, and see how we, well, both reflect on our successes, failures as a community, and where we should head in the future. And that's really what I hope that this interdisciplinary dialogue should be too. Joining me today, we have from the northwestern suburbs of Geneva, Peter Coveney, who is a professor at University College of London. He has been involved in numerous research projects that we will cover shortly, and he is also highly influential when it comes to running many of the centers of excellence infrastructures in the European Union, where I've been really thrilled to get a chance to interact with him, in particular CompBiomed. The topic for today and the interdisciplinary aspect is really this bridge from physics, math, the hard scientists, to the soft, green, floppy, lifelike sciences. And here, although Peter and I occasionally work with similar tools, we have relatively different approaches, where I tend to be stuck in the molecules and atoms. Peter has done hugely impressive work trying to approach this top-down instead, thinking of models of entire humans and everything, which is of course hard. But to me, I'm really looking forward to get the chance to learn more about this, and in particular, learn more about Peter. So Peter, it's great to have you here. For our audience, could you start with very briefly describing what is that you do research-wise?
The best way to start this is by saying, from my position at UCL, which is University College London, you mentioned, I run a Centre for Computational Science, and it has a catchphrase which summarizes what I do and I'm interested in, and it's called Advancing Science Through Computers. So that's our agenda. And you can see it's sort of well contrived because it reflects my own interests and belief in the fact that so many things are interdisciplinary here. What you can develop in one area today may end up being transferable and applicable somewhere else. And indeed, in my own experience and career, I've seen that happen several times. So I don't really wish to be defined or classified in any more narrow way than that.
That's fine. We'll see. We might end up classifying you one way or another. So how did you end up here? What's your background, your training?
Yeah, my training background is a large amount of physical sciences and mathematics, and I've spent time in my research career working in sort of fairly fundamental areas of what you might call field theory related to things like parity and time violating interactions, with applications actually in a molecular context as well. And then I've spent some time working indeed in the oil industry in very complicated problems. If you talk about the simple case of high energy physics and simple particles and so on, then I've actually wrestled with what I believe it to be the world's most complicated material. It's been known of since at least Roman times, and that's cement. It sounds so terribly messy that a lot of people would never go anywhere near it. And yet it is possible to make interesting scientific progress with that. And this is just in the inanimate space that I'm talking about now. Beyond that is the migration towards the, let's call it life and medical sciences. And that's really taken off for my research, probably in the last dozen years or so. And the reasons are to do with powerful computers and the availability of data, and our ability to potentially do things that have motivated me, such as patient-specific medicine. And actually, you know, I was very active in an earlier, very exciting European framework program, the FP7, where they had a whole initiative on the virtual physiological human. And that was something where, you know, I was transferring some of these other complex systems know-how into the human context. That was actually largely dominated by the upper levels that you alluded to earlier. In fact, virtual physiological human is a domain occupied by bioengineers, biomedical engineers, and physiologists. The role of molecules in that description is surprisingly downgraded. I was probably one of the very few who was always trying to remind people we must be able to connect these levels together.
So what's the goal of all this? Why do we need computing in these areas? What are the big challenges that, well, you or an extension, this entire community wants to solve with these virtual physiological humans? So
there's very different ways of answering that question. I prefer to treat it because of my motivations and sort of intellectual interests as something challenging to us academically and intellectually, and that's around our ability to make predictions. You know, the apotheosis, the highest thing you can achieve, I would argue, in a scientific context, is that to understand an area sufficiently well that you have a mathematical representation of it, and it is able to make predictions. It's not just going to do post hoc, as it were, rationalizations of experiments. And that's an area we might talk about in a minute. But if you ask, where has that been successful? Of course, the hard sciences, particularly physics, you have only to think of Einstein's gravitational wave prediction in 1915 kind of coming true a century later, and other instances that I could name. Higgs boson is one. Alan Turing's predictions of structural patterns, spatially stable patterns, his Turing structures, it took about 40 years for those to be shown to be true, as it were, experimentally. But these give you an idea of the power of prediction. Now, as you get more and more in control of things, you want to deal with more complicated events, and the best paradigm of that sort would be weather forecasting. Like, I want to know tomorrow's weather today. I don't want to know it in 3 weeks' time. How am I going to do that? And I think most of us realize the answer has been being able to solve pretty complicated equations, coupled sorts of systems with lots of parameters in them, but to be able to do those very fast on supercomputers with sufficient control of the uncertainty that we can get a prediction, at least for me in London, that point of, you can see the sun behind me, that's illusory. It's actually rather gray and raining quite frequently at the moment. I want to know if I need an umbrella, for instance. That's an actionable prediction I get from the weather. So what if we could do that in other areas? And in the case of biomedicine, the question is, can I make such predictions ahead of an intervention, some medical decision that could be done fast enough to influence it? I don't want it to be academic and afterwards to explain what was done, but to actually influence the decision.
And I think that's a great introduction, but it's a tremendous challenge. And I guess the comparison to weather predictions is interesting, because I guess we all we all trust weather predictions to the extent that we're irritated if they did not predict rain tomorrow, but you would have needed that umbrella anyway, right?
Yeah.
But none of us, you're not going to trust the prediction whether you need an umbrella on August 15th, because we know that there is no way in that's reliable. And somewhere here, there is this gray zone where I wouldn't say given up, but we realize that it's so difficult that we're not going to get 2-month weather predictions, at least not in our lifetime, likely. And I guess that's the challenge in life sciences too, because when we were preparing a little bit for this interview, I was thinking that historically, biology is not really a computational science, and not even a data science, I would argue. Well, maybe Mendel or so. But this all changed in the mid-20th century with the discovery of DNA and really turning biology digital. And in a way, I guess, when it turned digital, but not necessarily computational from the start. It was like 3, 4, 5 decades later that we got the revolution of bioinformatics and everything. And perhaps that is a great example of these digital twins that you alluded a bit to, that we have exactly the same model in the computer as we have in reality, for instance, when it comes to different COVID virus strains or so. But do you think, will we really be able to generalize that to disease in general, predicting whether I'm going to have high blood pressure or a heart attack in 20 years or so?
Well, that part of it is now talking about, your last question is what relates to so-called longitudinal studies, where longitudinal means over time. Being able to predict something in the human body tens of years ahead is really very tricky today in a context where you want to be able to treat people. I mean, obviously, if you were a molecular biologist, I don't think you are, correct me if I'm wrong, there are people like Dawkins who are caricatured as arguing, Richard Dawkins, that is, from Oxford, that we know the genome, as it were, it's a blueprint from cradle to grave. I don't think most of us take that too seriously, right? I mean, the shocking truth is, despite genomics and, the end of the millennium triumphal announcement of the first draft of the human genome, if you ask what we've done successfully since then with pure genomics, the returns have been rather meager, I would say. And what people forget when they talk about this is that, we actually only understand 1.7% of the sequencing of DNA. The rest of it, like more than 98%, is essentially like dark matter. We haven't properly understood that at all. So there's a huge amount still to be done there. So I mean, it's like the physical sciences. There are some problems which become tractable more easily that you can predict, and there are others that are not. I think the example of weather forecasts, over decades has become shown to be quite good for short-term purposes. But if you turn to other geological issues like earthquake prediction, that's still in quite a lamentable state. Yeah. So there's all kinds of issues here, and I would claim that we're going to be able to pick in the cliche low-hanging fruit of problems where you can tackle them reliably with existing methods, and others that become harder. It's like the single, polymorphism type genetic disease, which then makes everyone think that I can explain everyone's disease just by the genome, whereas it's much more complicated and non-linear. So there are going to be problems that are easier to handle on time scales that I'm talking about, and harder ones. But just briefly, if you think about the weather, you don't forget that everyone is also interested in climate change, and climate change is actually similar to the weather forecast, except that that's what the analogy with time evolution is. We're talking about that over a century or more. Will the temperature of the Earth rise by more than 6 degrees by the turn of this century? This is deemed to be a critical issue. So then we have to try and quantify the uncertainty we have about our predictions in order to be able to inform ourselves about what actions to take, even if we can't be precise about them. And that will be relevant to treating human beings as well.
I'll continue that digital twin thought just a little while. I have to confess, the first time I heard of digital twins in the context of humans or healthcare, I thought it was a corny idea. But then one starts to think a little bit more about it. And to those in the audience who don't know, the idea of a digital twin is it's gotten extremely popular in industry. For instance, I bet if Rolls-Royce is designing a new engine, you start by designing it in the computer, really.
Yeah.
And you know exactly how the engine operates in the computer. And of course, by the time the engine actually exists, you could still simulate everything the engine does in the computer too. And if the real engine doesn't really behave like it did in the computer, you could even argue that it's not an error in the model, it's an error with the engine. But that's of course not gonna, so basically if the human doesn't behave the way that our model does of the human, I think it's hard to argue that it's an error in the human, right? Or maybe it is, but it's hard to fix it in the human.
Yes, I mean, that's what happens in the biological sciences. I was implying that earlier, that empiricism and what the experiment tells you is paramount. So that then you get to the situation where you're entitled to try and rationalize with your models and simulations after the event. But I'm arguing that we must be able to transcend that. And I'm not claiming, we're going to do that in its entirety for a virtual human. We have to discuss what we mean by a virtual human in this sense. There isn't going to be one that just comes along and replaces me in talking to you at any moment in the near future. But again, there are sort of parts of the picture that are already taking shape that in the fullness of time will, by a systematic means of kind of building up data and so on, end up potentially being quite a high fidelity representation. And I'm not going to go, unless you provoke me into it, to talk about the ability of such an entity to be conscious. But when I do talk about the virtual human, it's amazing how many types of response you get from a general audience. Like, oh, this sounds worrying. It's going to predict my demise when I'm going to die. Or, are we going to actually harm it when we conduct experiments on it and so on?
So maybe we should, that's a great point, I think, to introduce this love story problem we talk about in the title, right? That
yes.
Why do you think biology, and I so agree with your title, right? We all tend to be very excited by biology. In a way, the more complex a problem is, the more interesting it is, because then we need a very, very large computer to solve it. So why is that most biologists, I wouldn't say that they're not interested, but they're usually not particularly excited about the math?
That's correct. And I think that's, again, due to the formation and background on them. But you yourself alluded to the evolution of bioinformatics has become a massive thing in recent times. And I encounter now quite frequently people, let's say in UCL, students who are doing biosciences who actually have remarkably good computational skills. Now, there can be a difference between someone who's able to use a computer effectively and sort of follow through from the underpinning mathematics and so on. But I do worry about that, because the conceptual basis of what we're getting at is something of a mechanistic representation of the world, right? We, I say, as physical scientists, talk about laws of nature. Second law of thermodynamics might be one. And then we say everything's subordinated to it. But when you talk to a biologist, their notion of the role of these laws is much more flaky, actually, and they're not quite sure what we mean by laws of nature. Whereas if we can bring them to understand the importance of these kind of constraints, boundary conditions almost on the way we study systems, we've got a better chance of being able to quantify them. And the quantification goes back to what I'm saying about the desire to be able to not just explain after the event, but to actually predict things before they occur, because that's where the real impact in the long run would come, I think.
So that makes me, so I agree in many ways, but this also made me think of an old quote by Bruce Alberts, who's a professor of biochemistry, long-serving editor of Science magazine. And I couldn't find the exact quote, but it's roughly that many people go around thinking that math is hard and biology is easy. But his argument is really the other way around, because math is fundamentally very easy because it is governed by equations. And as long as you know those equations, you know everything. It can be a difficult practice, but it's not really hard in that sense. While biology is extremely hard simply because we don't know the equations. So do you think this is part of it, that many of us, we kind of oversimplify biology? We come with a few simple equations, say in principle, if you just follow the laws of thermodynamics, we can explain everything. It's just that in practice, we can't explain anything.
Well, I agree. I mean, I don't want to sound anything triumphalist here. I think we probably would all agree, however, that we have a science here which is supposedly all-encompassing. We don't think there's something outside it, like the vital force, that isn't capable of explanation using our scientific methods. If that were the case, it would be like a paradigm shift in a physics scenario where we'd have to change some of the laws. So I don't believe most of us think that there's something missing there. It is related to the complexity and how you can manage to formulate the problems in a mathematical way which is anywhere near, approximately correct, because these models typically are models, they're not the reality. They are simplifications. And the issue is, if you took evolution, I would argue probably there is no mathematical formulation of Darwinian natural selection. It's kind of the general theory based on a verbal description. And of course, people try to abstract bits of it in order to explain it. But the status of that model, which is often thought of as one of the greatest theories science has produced, is very different from the physical science ones. But I would like to think that we can, and we always will have to rely on a mathematical description of things in order to be able to quantify them and then run simulations of them. But we agree in all cases, those will have approximations. And it's the difficulty with biological systems is understanding what the limits of your theory are, where the approximations are that may betray your, predictions and so on.
And I guess that's a challenge in particular at a conference like this. I think it's hard to argue that anybody audience is not going to be interested in models and computation, right? That on the one hand, I think we all say that there are going to be amazing studies we can do with exaflop and 10 and 100 exaflop machines too. But at some point, there is also the challenge, at least sometimes I feel in my area, that we keep saying that if we just had better models and faster computers, we're going to solve things. The only problem is that the community said that in 1960, 1970, 1990, 1990, 2000, 2010, and we're still saying it in 2020. So are we really fundamentally making progress, or is it just that we keep making ever more complex models? It's just that we're still hundreds of orders of magnitude away from many biological systems. Do we just need more complex models, or do we need completely different types of models?
I think the problem with the computations is the nature of these computers that we wrestle with. What's happened with Denard's law and Moore's law kind of breaking down. And as I say, computers, for example, have become fatter, not faster. I think we understand what we mean by that. We can tackle a lot of problems which are larger because of parallel, let's say, spatial domain decomposition, which is very effective. And we've got gazillions of nodes. And if we can parallelize there, we can do a bigger system. But the fundamental problem is that, again, the equations of mathematical physics are all serial in time in that sense. We increment from one time step to the next. So if you do more spatial domains, actually it ends up taking you longer typically to do a time step. But the interesting physics, or if you wish to call it that, or biology, needs to access much longer time scales because there's a bigger system to be of any interest. And there's a kind of wall that's running away with it from us there. So just doing brute force calculations in many instances just isn't worth it. I mean, it's like trying to argue you could do a very large long-range MD system on an enormous computer. It may be breaking a world record, but typically it's not going to interest the people you want to pay attention to your studies. So we have to have ways of bridging timescales really to be able to move these systems between the shorter scales of the system and the more longer ones. Most biologists are occupying higher levels. The question is, how do we relate those to each other? That's still a computational problem. It's still a challenge, just in material science. How do I design, put the ingredients that I want from a point of view of, a nanocomposite material and then produce a fuselage or a wing of an aircraft? That's a huge challenge because it goes over an enormous number of scales. But we sort of understand how we can go across them. So scale bridging seems to be a very important thing. Innovations like that, potentially on some of these computers, there are ways of, if you bring coupling in, to doing that more effectively. But it's not always, I agree with you, the idea that the computers are just going to solve our problems. That's very, very...
No, and I guess what I'm increasingly worrying about is, are these really solutions or band-aids that we're trying to put on a stupid approach that we should have given up 20 years ago? So again, there is no question how successful many of these simulations regimes have been, and maybe life science is not even the best example, say computational fluid dynamics, right? It's amazing what they can do with larger and larger computers. But to be a bit self-critical, one could also argue that many of the things we do, simulations, particle interactions, solving Newton's equations of motion, aren't those, you can even argue, these are problem formulations that we got stuck with because traditional computers were pretty good at solving those types of equations. And then as computers have evolved, and maybe computers in the future aren't really going to be optimized for that type of work. But are we still clinging too much to the type of problem formulations that computers were good at 20 years ago?
It's related, as you say, to the inertia and the nature of the computers we've built. And the point is, there is a certain type of diversification now taking place, which could be criticized for the hype content of it, such as quantum computing, which is now claimed to be a breakthrough in electronic structure calculations, right? I mean, there are so many startups claiming to produce solutions there, it's not real. And so there's that. And the other area is potentially, analog computing, because one of the problems here is that's what computing was when it started, and it went into a discrete form for a long time. But it's now, hitting the buffers, as you suggest, in certain respects. So the question is, could we develop maybe general purpose or even special purpose analog computers that will do things much more interestingly? And indeed, the likelihood is they won't be anywhere near as energy demanding as these digital ones, which begin to put us in an awkward position today as contributing ourselves to perhaps climate change, by dint of the incredible cost of of running the machines. So I'm really in favor of trying to look at different types of architectures to deal with these problems. I mean, the discrete issue always bugs me in descriptions of reality. As you probably know, I'm concerned about when that approximation just doesn't hold anymore, and we ought to try and do something better than that.
So in terms of various architectures, the most immediate one that everyone is talking about, and then we're going to have quite a few sessions about too, it's of course AI, streaming architectures, whatever you call it, deep learning. There are lots of arguments for this and everything, but I would actually pose that challenge the same way we started using traditional architectures. This is one really powerful architecture that is obviously available right now, and we can even argue in terms of value for money, it's better than anything else. So rather than arguing whether that's a good architecture or not, should we simply accept that this is the architecture we're going to have to live with realistically over the next, say, 2 decades before quantum computing maybe gets there? So should we give up traditional work and focus on AI?
No, definitely. I don't support that idea. I see AI as it's being referred to with machine learning, it's the triumvirate with big data, machine learning, and AI, as something that can potentially do an awful lot to support and accelerate some of the work we do. But, I'm strongly in favor of making sure we use it in a controlled way, which means, again, going back to the idea that there are, I don't know if we developed this yet, but mechanisms, things are happening for a reason. And the risk with a machine learned solution is it tries to find some answer to a problem but can't explain why something is happening. And that approach, which I call blind big data analysis and so on, is dangerous for a large number of reasons. One of which is the dimensionality of these problems, if not thought of scientifically, is just run away with you. You'll be hit by the curse of dimensionality, which is that the number of dimensions means the data that you need is essentially scaling exponentially in that number. And you will never have enough data to cover that. So it's really dangerous. What you have to understand is structural characteristics of your problem, which needs some theory behind it in order to keep the thing under control. And then, dare I say again, insist that your machine learned solutions obey the laws of nature, whatever they mean, so that they're not doing things that are not sensible. And then, of course, it can speed up many things that a regular computation could take a long time over. So they can really help with that type of work.
And yet, I can actually understand that people say working in drug design or pharmacy or something there. One of the reasons why they are excited with AI is that, crappy as the solutions are, they can occasionally make predictions, like we started talking about, right? They can make predictions that are, well, at least slightly better than a random surgeon, for instance, in cases where no other computational method can make the predictions. And I sat down and thought a little bit about this morning about COVID, and there's of course a great amount of fantastic code work that has been done with supercomputers. But again, if we're going to be super self-critical here, and what is hopefully largely going to solve COVID around the world now is vaccines, right? What have computers really contributed?
That's a great question.
Not a whole lot, right?
No. In terms of vaccine development, I regard that as something that modeling hasn't played a significant role in at all. And the embarrassing thing is the antivirals, which are the drugs that people are looking for, have still not materialized. And that's kind of following the conventional drug design route. On the other hand, vaccines, the new mRNA vaccines are a really superb creation and very, very effective. But, that area of modeling, if I may take a sort of away from just doing, let's call it our favorite atomistic modeling, is pathways and nonlinear dynamics, right? So, I've worked in the past on models where you look at the infection of the pathogen, which might be a bacterium or a virus like HIV, and understand the cascade of processes which are taking place there at a level that's amenable to solution with, ordinary differential equations. So actually, computation, it becomes comparatively cheap, except there's a vast number of them, and then you have lots of parameters in play. But in principle, many of those things are accessible to an interaction with experiments, and we're able to predict things like what's the pattern of the so-called epitopes, the broken down components of the virus that invaded you, that then project on the surface of the cell. And that's work, that's an example of work we've done with modeling and theory that is ahead of experiment, because no one actually today is still able to do what they need to do, which is some form of mass spectrometry to characterize what's on the surface. So that runs into a problem with editors of journals. They say, you haven't got any experimental evidence that what you're predicting is the case. But the point is there, you can start to develop immunodominant theories of what's going to be on the surface and what you might need to help to design vaccines. So it's an area where, ironically, we've done stuff on HIV and there still isn't a vaccine available for that. But now in the case of COVID, things are moving much faster. And I do believe that there are models of that sort which should interact with the observations and could help with subsequent developments here, because the variants are the real problem, right? And then how do we cope with the resistance that they have to drugs and so on and so forth?
I wasn't actually expecting that you would agree that much with that. Of course, to defend computing a bit, I think computing has helped, but maybe not with our type of models. But of course, we wouldn't be able to assemble these genomes without fairly powerful computers, right? We wouldn't be able to identify the mutants, and that we wouldn't be able to reconstruct the three-dimensional cryo-EM structures without computational programs. And I bet that there is a whole range of docking and everything used in drug design. And there's even been a handful of fascinatingly simple papers trying to answer questions so that when we have a limited access to vaccines, should we start by giving everyone one dose? And it's, of course, by our standards, it's not maybe the problem is not sexy enough for us to start getting involved in running it on supercomputers. But if you're running the healthcare system in a country, it's a very immediate and important problem that thankfully somebody solved using a computer. So that maybe a challenge for us is that those of us working in basic research, we tend to get too obsessed with the extremely complicated problem, while we don't focus enough on the very immediate problems that would make people appreciate the research area more.
I agree with that. Actually, again, you mentioned the project called Comp Biomed. What does interest me about it is the breadth of the computing we have there, which is some of it, what you would call much lower end computing using HPC of some sort. But that's the end which actually is currently having an impact in hospitals. All the higher stuff going towards the exascale is just too far away from that. So I think it's great to have a combination of these things where you've got some people who are able to interact directly with clinicians with infrastructure that they can work with. That is really important.
So since we are on the horizon now, we're likely going to have 1 or 2 exascale machines in 2022. How would that change these things in practice? Some of these grand challenges we spoke about in the beginning, will there be concrete new things that we can do on these machines that weren't possible when you started these centers?
My answer to that is yes, we can, and I'm looking forward to you challenging me on that. But I'm active in 2 areas where I'm confident that's the case, like the virtual human scenario, right? Which you spoke about earlier. For me, I really believe in the validity of doing that. And so on these very large machines now, we can, by using data, patient-specific data, as it were, derived from whole body images. We've got the entire arterial and venous trees, and we can couple them. And now we're actually putting heart models in. My colleagues, I develop blood flow models, but my colleagues in Barcelona have this code which is famous called ALIA, the ALIA red code. So we're putting these 2 things together. We can only do that on these enormous machines because each one of them is an HPC challenge in its own right. So it's becoming a coupled model, which isn't so trivial to make work, but it's there. And so I still embrace the idea that as these machines get larger, we can put more of call them bits of Lego in to do these bigger problems. The challenge, though, goes back to what I said earlier. If you remember, the fatness of the machine, which admits these large spatial domains, is still a problem for us when we want to do long time scales. That's really the fourth shortcoming there. In the other area that I'm interested in, you mentioned drug design. It's an interesting concatenation of these smaller jobs that can then still invade the entirety of a machine, but are heterogeneous with things like molecular dynamics as part of the calculations to do accurate things when they're needed. But as you mentioned earlier, we can start a workflow with really cheap docking calculations or even machine learned versions of those, so we don't actually do much compute at all, and then build a big loop around all of these things. So we can have multiple workflows that are then integrated into one at a scale that would never have been possible before. That means it's potentially possible to use that environment to do some genuine in silico discovery. That's an ambition. I'm not claiming it's there yet or has worked, but I see that as something that we can use those machines to do.
I know that you both talked and been actively engaged in the whole challenge around quantum computing and what we might be able to do with quantum computing. When do you see these development challenges happening? Are we talking about a couple of years? Are there concrete challenges that, well, particularly young people in the audience should start thinking about right now solving? Or are we talking about one of these fields where there's going to be a constant 50 years to a working machine?
Right. Just before we go to quantum computing, I've now also become slightly sucked into working with the dreaded fusion, plasma fusion community, which is exactly an analog of this, like it was 30 years away for donkey's years. In the UK now, they've just happened to have got a government which is big on green energy, and it's declaring we want our first fusion energy plant by 2040. So that's only 20 years away. And there's all kinds of stuff going on around that to try and make that happen. Part of it is to you can make these predictions about the stability of plasmas using software and computation and getting the errors under control. Okay, so now we go to quantum computing, which is beginning to be a threat like that of it's going to be, I think it will be decades before we can actually do anything useful with it, right? In the general sense that people hype it, that it's going to solve these problems, let's say, in the pharma industry. There's a big irony in this. All the big, giant tech companies have been saying machine learning is your solution to drug discovery. But some other branch of the same companies is saying it's quantum computing. Make your mind up which one you want to believe. Quantum, the reality is we're in this NISC era, right? With noisy intermediate scale devices. And there's so many problems with error correction and correlation times that are so short, we can't do anything easily at all. So it's small problems, and it's going to be like that for a pretty long time. So the molecules that people are looking at are very small, right? Water is still arguably the biggest challenge there. And I'm talking about one molecule of water, not bulk behavior. So what I think we should be trying to do is develop genuinely scalable algorithms which are embedded in the sense that some part of a quantum calculation is amenable to a quantum computer and maybe doable in the short term, but the rest of it is like, may I say, in the abbreviations QMMM, which won its Nobel Prize in 2013, is doing classically based DFT. So something in the middle is handling something you really care about with higher accuracy, but it's something that's scalable so that in the longer run, we can look at bigger problems. But the problem that you can look at now might be interesting, whereas the case studies of diatomics and so on just don't interest anyone beyond the group. So what I'm after always here is, can we do something which is sufficiently interesting that other people care about it than the aficionados who are working in it? And that's the way we're looking at trying to do something useful there.
And I think that's a great way to start rounding this up, right? Because I would actually argue, I think that there is more love from biologists than we think. But biologists and biochemists that I work more with in the day-to-day lab, that they are fairly unimpressed. They don't really care about methods. To the good ones, there are really only two types of methods that help them solve the particular pet problem they have right now, and methods that don't. And it doesn't really matter how fancy the method is if it doesn't help them solve their problem. And it's their problem. It's a very personal matter to them. And if one take this in perspective, like 20, 30 years ago, many of these computational methods were treated as things that the cat would have dragged in or so. But if you just browse the latest issue of Science or Nature, and every single high impact paper nowadays with a new structure or something, they're doing a simulation on them. Even as a simulation person, sometimes I'm asking myself, why on earth are they simulating this? But maybe that's actually the ultimate sign of affection here. They trust these methods so much nowadays that they don't even consider not using theory. But of course, it's not necessarily the equations they're in love with. They love your results.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the X-ray crystallography was for long the yardstick, right? You just had to report a structure like that. But I think we all realize those structures are highly artificial, right? They've had to be treated and frozen and at very low temperatures. So why should we think that those are a better representation than something that might be based on those, but thermalized in a computer and the dynamical aspects studied? I think, yeah, you're right. There's a very large number of people now who buy into the importance of those kind of visual representations at least.
Peter, we've used our time. This was fascinating. It's great for me to learn so much, both about what you do in quantum and other areas. I bet this discussion is going to continue. And one of the things that is interesting with PASC in particular is that it's a very cross-disciplinary conference. So by all means, if you have questions, you can keep asking them in the conference interface. And both Peter and I will try to answer them later too. But with that, let me thank Peter so much for giving us this insight. And then let me head back to Shinny.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thank you, Peter. That was absolutely fascinating, I have to say, wide-ranging and engrossing discussion. So I'm sure everybody enjoyed it really very much. Made 40 minutes go very quickly indeed. So as Eric said, you've both kindly agreed to stay on and to answer any questions that might appear in the chat. So I would just encourage people, if they would like to continue the conversation, they can do that for a little while with you both now. So once again, thank you very much for such a super discussion. It was really fascinating.